7-year Jinn curse. Adam Johnson has spent his life walking the spiritual tightrope, seeking solace in Christianity, then Judaism, yet never finding peace. His soul, it seemed, was marked. Every 7 years, like a cruel celestial cycle, tragedy struck with inhuman precision. It began when he was 7. His father, once full of life, perished in a freak accident, his car veering off a bridge, his body lost to the depths below. At 14, their home became a death trap, the pipes bursting inexplicably, flooding the basement until Adam was nearly swallowed whole. At 21, a nightmare manifested. Masked men invaded his home, binding him, forcing him to watch as they terrorized his children. The horror never left him. Now, at 28, he lived in fear, marking the days as the 7th-year curse loomed once again. His nights were plagued by visions, shadow figures with elongated limbs, whispering in guttural tongues, their faces shrouded in a darkness that seemed to breathe. Always they ended the same, a voice, raw and ancient, whispering in his ear, "It is time." His mother, Sharon Johnson, harbored a terrible secret. She never spoke of it but wept when she thought Adam wasn't looking. Desperate for answers, he searched the attic where he found an old leather-bound book, its pages brittle with time. Inside, his mother's trembling handwriting left him frozen in place. Jacqueline Robertson cursed you. Jacqueline Robertson, a name buried in childhood memories. Once his mother's friend, now her enemy. Obsessed with the occult, she had embraced something far beyond human comprehension. Jealousy had turned her heart black, and rather than harm Sharon directly, she had sought a darker path. She had found an ancient Islamic grimoire, its ink infused with blood, its words never meant to be spoken. She had summoned a jinn, one of the old ones, patient and cruel, binding it to Adam's fate. Every 7 years it would rise, feeding on his suffering, fracturing his life bit by bit. As Adam stood with the book in his trembling hands, the temperature in the house plummeted. The air thickened, pressing against him like unseen hands. And then, that voice, "It is time." The lights flickered. A shadow stretched impossibly long against the walls, shifting unnaturally. Then, a crash. Glass shattered. A mournful wail rose, the sound coming from nowhere and ended everywhere at once. Adam turned to flee, but his body refused to move. The shadows coiled around his ankles, his wrists, dragging him back. His vision exploded into fire and sand, a contract written in blood, black eyes staring from the abyss. He screamed, the sound lost in the void. This time, the jinn's torment grew insidious. It wore the form of his grandmother, a specter walking through walls, lingering in the halls. The familiar strains of childhood lullabies play from unseen sources, scents of her old perfume, and home-cooked meals clung to the air. It was a trap, luring him into belief, into vulnerability, waiting for him to invite her into his life. But the jinn's true presence revealed itself through decay. Mildew crept along the walls, maggots wriggled through rotting wood, termites chewed relentlessly through his home. The very air thickened with rot. Flies swarmed, their numbers growing until they blotted out the light. The scent of festering waste clung to his skin, invading his lungs. The horror turned perverse. Visions of his grandmother lying in his bed, naked, unnatural, a grotesque mockery of her memory. Desperate, Adam called the police, but their laughter was cruel. A man complaining of a naked grandmother in his bed. He had become the town's joke. Months later, the termites won. His home collapsed under their relentless hunger, forcing him to flee to another house, but he knew the escape was temporary. The 7th year would return, and the jinn would demand more than his suffering. The next cycle would claim his very soul.
So my story begins during my Islamic studies classes, and summer heat in Makkah was relentless, thick and heavy, pressing down like an unseen hand. Even at night, the air carried the scent of the desert, mingled with the faint aroma of oud and the distant murmur of Quranic recitations from the mosques. We were students then, seeking knowledge beneath the towering presence of King Fahd Mosque, living in the humble apartments nestled beneath its foundations. It was 7 of us shared a single room, packed tightly on thin mattresses laid out over the cool tiled floor. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my leg bent up as I tried to find comfort in the sweltering air. The rhythmic sound of my friends' breathing should have been reassuring, but the silence that hung between their breaths felt unnatural, as if something unseen was listening. Then, without warning, something gripped me, hard. My entire body jolted, shaken violently by invisible hands. My breath hitched, and I turned sharply, scanning the room. Everyone was asleep, their faces calm, undisturbed. Heart pounding, I reached over and shook one of the guys awake. He groggily opened his eyes, barely registering my fear before mumbling, "Just go sleep in the other room, man." His nonchalance did little to settle my nerves, but I took his advice. The adjoining room was dimly lit by a flickering bulb, the air thick with something I couldn't name. 3 others lay asleep inside. As I stepped in, the ceiling fan groaned, its frame swaying back and forth, yet the blades remained motionless. My skin prickled, but exhaustion won. I lay down and closed my eyes. 5 minutes later, the door burst open. The same friend who had dismissed my fears now stood there, wide-eyed and trembling. "Something grabbed me," he gasped, voice barely above a whisper. "It held me down, covered my mouth. I couldn't breathe. I tried to move, but it wouldn't let go. Then I managed to whisper, 'A'udhu billahi,' and it let me go." Fear clamped down on the room like an iron fist. We were all awake now, our whispers hushed and frantic. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. Without hesitation, we called the imam, waking him in the dead of night. He arrived without question, his face grim as he stepped inside. That night he slept among us, reciting verses until the break of dawn. But the apartment held its secret still. Almost every night, when the city had quieted into its sacred stillness, we would hear it, the sound of footsteps echoing above us in the mosque, rapid and relentless, as if someone were running. But no one was there. We had checked too many times to count. And then there was the voice. In one darkened corner of our apartment, faint but unmistakable. Someone, something, was reciting the Quran. The voice was ethereal, hauntingly beautiful, surpassing even the greatest chorus we had ever heard. It sent chills through our bones, for we knew that no human throat could produce such a sound. The world is a land of the unseen, where the Jinn walk among men, unseen but ever present. Some whisper in the ears of the lost, others seek the light, reciting the words of Allah in the dead of night. And some, it seems, do not like to be disturbed.
The Rashid family moved into their new home on the outskirts of Al-Madinah, where the city's golden glow faded into the vast, open desert. Their house was old, its thick wooden doors carved with faded geometric patterns, its stone floors worn smooth by generations before them. The call to Maghrib prayer still echoed faintly from the distant masjid as Amina lit the last of the brass lanterns, filling the house with a warm, flickering glow. It was meant to be a fresh start, a blessing, but something about the house felt wrong. At first it was subtle, the scent of oud incense burned in the evenings, yet at times an acrid, charred smell would creep through the hallways like burnt hair. The air was thick with something unseen, pressing against their skin, like the weight of 100 eyes, watching from the dark. And then there was Yusuf. It began on their first night. Amina tucked Yusuf into his small wooden bed, smoothing the embroidered blanket over him. The child's wide, dark eyes stared past her, toward the dimly lit corner of the room. "Mama, he's here!" Amina froze, a chill creeping up her spine. "Who, Habibi?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. "The man in the corner," Yusuf whispered, barely moving his lips. "He says I shouldn't be afraid, but he never blinks." Amina's stomach twisted. She forced herself to look at the empty corner, at the shadows cast by the lantern's weak flame. "There's no one there, my love. It's just your imagination." But deep down she knew better. She kissed his forehead, murmured Ayat al-Kursi under her breath, and left the room. As she closed the door, she could have sworn she heard another whisper. Not Yusuf's. At first Khaled dismissed her fears. "Children make up stories," he said, sipping his strong Arabic coffee, the scent of cardamom thick in the air. "Let him be." But Amina noticed the small things. The way Yusuf's eyes would dart to the empty corners of the house, the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long after sunset, the way the lanterns flickered even with no wind. Then came the night she awoke to whispers, not the soft murmurs of her husband breathing beside her, but a low, slithering voice curling through the air. She sat up, heart pounding, and listened. It was coming from Yusuf's room. Slowly she pushed open the door. The lantern had gone out. The room was bathed in darkness, except for the moonlight spilling through the latticed window, casting strange, broken shapes on the walls. And there, sitting cross-legged on his bed, was Yusuf. He wasn't asleep. His lips moved in silence, as if answering someone unseen. His eyes were unfocused, his hands gripping the blanket so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Yusuf," she whispered, stepping closer. His head snapped toward her with unnatural speed. For the briefest moment his eyes weren't his own. They were black, pitch black. Amina screamed. Yusuf blinked, his face twisting in confusion. "Mama, why are you scared?" She yanked him into her arms, shaking. "Who were you talking to?" "The man," he said softly. "He says you shouldn't be here." Amina barely slept after that. She burned Bahur incense in every room, letting the thick, fragrant smoke curl against the old walls. She played Surah al-Baqarah on repeat, but the feeling never left. One night, as she tucked Yusuf in, she noticed something odd. The closet door, an old wooden thing with a brass handle, was slightly open. She always kept it shut. A coldness seeped from inside, not just a draft, but something deeper. "Did you open your closet, Habibi?" she asked. Yusuf shook his head. "He likes to hide there." Amina felt her throat close. With trembling hands, she reached for the door handle, pulling it open. Nothing, just an empty space filled with neatly folded clothes. And yet, as she backed away, she could have sworn she saw a handprint in the dust. Not a child's. Too long, too thin. That night she barely slept, clutching her prayer beads until dawn. The nights grew worse. The scent of burning filled the house at odd hours. The whispers turned to faint, rasping laughter. Doors slammed on their own. Then, one night, Amina awoke to a strange sound, a wet, choking noise. She bolted upright. Beside her, Khalid was asleep. But Yusuf's room, his door was open. She ran. Yusuf was standing in the middle of his room, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His lips moved, but the voice that came from him was not his. It was deep, guttural, echoing. "You should not have come here." Amina grabbed him, shaking. "Leave my son alone." Yusuf let out a terrible, rasping laugh. His small fingers dug into her wrist with unnatural strength. His body convulsed, his back arching. A black shadow flickered behind him, something formless, shifting, crawling along the walls. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Yusuf collapsed in her arms, unconscious. The scent of burning oud filled the room. From the corner of her eye, the closet door creaked open. At dawn, Amina sought help. The Imam arrived, his eyes dark with understanding. He walked through the house, murmuring verses under his breath. He sprinkled zam, zam, and rose water at the doorways, reciting prayers as the walls trembled. When he entered Yusuf's room, he stopped. "It is strong," he murmured. He turned toward the closet. Amina held her breath as he placed his hand against the wood, reciting Surah al-Falaq. The door rattled violently. A terrible, inhuman shriek filled the air. The walls shook, the lanterns shattered. The closet burst open, revealing nothing, just darkness. A darkness that went too deep, deeper than it should. And then it was gone. Yusuf gasped awake. The house fell silent. "It is done," the Imam whispered, "but it will try to return." Amina clutched her son, tears spilling onto his hair. Outside, the desert wind howled. In the distance, the Adhan for Fajr rang out, clear and strong. For now, the Jinn had left. But Amina knew the truth. Some doors once opened are never